Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the conference on populism in Latin America and beyond. As those of you who are able to join us yesterday will know, we're involving people from really around the world, and some people have easier links than others, so we just hang on for a few minutes to enable people to join before we actually start the first session. Today we've got 3 sessions which are focusing on gender, institutions, and COVID-19. And then finally, we have the keynote talk, which I know many people are looking forward to, by Steve Levitsky. And after that, Anthony Pereira will say some concluding remarks. So I think we're in for a really exciting day, just as I think we were yesterday. We've heard lots of comments from people about how they've very much enjoyed the conference. So it's going to be a long day today, but I'm sure that everyone will find something interesting in it. So we'll just hang on for a moment whilst people join, and then I will hand over. Okay, since I don't want to take up the valuable time of those people who are presenting this afternoon, I just want to hand over to Alessandra Beber Castillo, who will be chairing the first session, which focuses on gender. Alessandra.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We have our first session here today on gender. We will have 4 presentations. The first one, the evolution of Argentine populism under Peron, gender, poverty, and exile in the new historical novels of Tomas Eloy Martinez from Mariya Dzhyoyeva from the University of Toronto. Then we'll have Enfrentar como homem, Bolsonaro's populism and performing hegemonic masculinity from Theo, Aiolfi, and Giulia from the University of Warwick. Women in Bolsonaro's administration, gender roles and the role of gender in maintaining far-right populism during the COVID-19 pandemic from Ana Carolina Nunes de Macedo from Federal University of Ceará. And then intellectual imperialism and selection bias in the study of populism, violence, gender, and elite support from Stacey from Auburn University. Mariya Dzhyoyeva, the floor is yours if you'd like to share your screen with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. I'll start by sharing my presentation. So studying patterns of power always involves the gender dichotomy because domination implicates, at least historically and at least in the Western mentality, greater physical strength, equivalent speed and mobility. As indicated by Hernandez Pita, the development of these attributes traditionally associated with men and can be traced to the times before the Industrial Revolution. If we view populism in this context, the populist governments of Juan Domingo Peron were both a continuation of this tradition and a revolutionary phenomenon whose socio-political and cultural repercussions are felt to this day. As pointed out in Dietze and Roth, contemporary research on populism often overlooks the intimate connection between populism and gender. Although the tendency to trace connections between power and gender is not new, little is known about how gender penetrates the political fabric of populist regimes, not as a relationship of men and women in the ruling ideology, but rather as a more abstract idea of masculine or feminine governing styles. This presentation will analyze the depiction of the gendered component of Peronism and its evolution in the context of power and exile, as they are represented in the novels of Tomas Eloy Martinez, one of prominent representatives of Argentinian writing diaspora. The periods that find themselves in the foreground of Martinez's novels stretch from 1946 to 1955 and from 1973 to 1974. To appreciate the significance of gender in the construction of Peron's populist brand, it is necessary to understand the demographic of the Argentinian society of that period. As indicated by Insosti, it is commonly believed that the period corresponding to the first Peronism was dominated by the patriarchal gender model, and that any manifestation of the queer conscience would be extremely rare, if not impossible. Nevertheless, there is a growing number of studies that point to a much more complex reality. As pointed out by Archa and Ben, sexuality and gender relations in Argentina on the eve of the first Peronism were determined by European predominantly male immigration and a high percentage of youth in the population. Both factors weakened the nuclear family and facilitated homosexual relationships. Considering that the upper and middle classes were distant from the masses and not very numerous, it would be accurate to say that the heteronormative model was followed only in the minority of the population. Therefore, the need to seek the support of the masses for Peron populist regime meant professing heteronormativity without casting the worker as amoral or reluctant to embrace the patriarchal values. Consequently, as shown by Suarez Casino, Peronist doctrine took the conscience, habits, lifestyles, and values of the working class as it found them and affirmed their sufficiency and validity. As pointed out by Milanesio, Peron's self-definition was strongly based on exalting a masculine identity connected to the lower classes rather than elites. In one of his early speeches, Peron claimed that I only have 3 titles to show for myself, all of which make me proud. That of being a soldier, that of being considered Argentina's first worker, and that of being a patriot. The selection of these 3 roles was far from accidental. All 3 implied physical strength, bravery, and a firm sense of solidarity to achieve common goals. As Peron's government took over the working class identity, transforming it following its heteronormative ideal, the queer stigma has been displaced towards the opposition, with it being branded as afeminados revoltosos. As shown in the study by Ortiz Hernandez, a man achieves masculinity through these 3 basic negations that he constantly needs to prove. That he is not a woman, that he is not a baby, and that he is not a gay. While Martinez depicts Peron proving these crucial points to bolster his masculine appeal and the appeal of his government, he at the same time does a remarkable job by undermining Peron's efforts. To enhance the masculinity of his political image, Peron commissions a ghostwritten autobiography that features a remarkable arsenal of patriarchal imagery that evokes the extraordinary exemplary lives of the past. Almost immediately, Martinez frustrates his plan, revealing some details about Peron's childhood that would not fit with the image he intends to broadcast. In La novela de Peron, the Peron's novel, Martinez reveals some intimate details regarding Peron's arrival into the world. The Toledos had made preparations for a girl. Even the diapers stitched by grandmother Mercedes had little pink ribbons, and Aunt Honoria, who had decided to give the infant her silver earrings, prayed to God miraculously to change its mistaken sex. Similarly, when Peron starts school, he goes to the quote-unquote, the school on the ground floor at 548 Calle San Martin, officially known as Girls Upper School Section 7, even though 9 of the 30 pupils were boys. Speaking about his childhood, Peron constantly underscores his precocious masculinity, calling himself el gauchito crudito y duro, and claiming that at 10 years old, my thinking was almost like man's. I went around Buenos Aires on my own, and my mother's or grandmother's skirts held none of the attractions they did for other kids of my age. At the same time, Martinez reveals the depth of the trauma produced by Peron's mother adultery that makes him secretly depending on her and desiring to be unborn and dwell in her uterus forever. When Peron is trying to play the role of a guardian of the patriarchal order, Martinez derails this image by focusing Peron's affection on another authoritarian leader, Mussolini. Peron speaks about his alleged meeting with Mussolini quite explicitly, quote unquote. I felt like embracing him, but the solemnity of the place held me back. Similar homoeroticism has been also observed and studied in connection with other authoritarian leaders, such as Fidel Castro and Leonid Brezhnev. It is rather ironic that such sentiment is absent when Peron recalls his first wife, Potota, whose affection he dismisses as chiquilinadas, or childish ways. Also, when Peron speaks about the motives that prompted him to get married, he bluntly states, quote unquote, the Lodge takes a dim view of bachelor officers. While he does not address directly the problem of homosexuality in the armed forces, it is abundantly clear from other mentions in this context that dim view refers to the suspicion that an unmarried officer may be gay. As Martinez depicts Peron in exile, his subversive approach to queering and feminizing Peron takes a milder tone, perhaps because he feels the solidarity of a fellow exile. When describing Peron in exile in Spain prior to his return to Argentina for a short last stint as president, Martinez notes that Peron changes his strategy. From being a masculine, strong leader, he switches to intrigues and demagoguery. He skillfully uses the discourse of abandonment and defeat, calling himself a herbivore lion, while patiently restoring his political power from afar by waging guerrillas and controlling the most aggressive labor syndicates. To undermine Peron, Martinez opposes the admiration of his followers with some intimate details from secret privileged sources that deal a major blow to his masculine reputation. On one hand, Peron writes an autobiography remembering his glorious past and make plans for a triumphant return. On the other, he lives a boring exilic life in Madrid and does not stop complaining about the cold treatment that he receives from Francisco Franco. The mere mention of another patriarchal leader grants him that grants him asylum instantly feminizes Peron. He is obsessed with the idea that Franco is ignoring him, which makes him resemble a forgotten lover that is suffering in abandonment, quote unquote. Franco never answered my letters. The ministers refused to receive me. Am I a pariah? That was what I wanted to know. Nothing doing. Deafness in the palaces. Finally, Martinez's criticism of Peron is reflected in the motive on infertility. Contrary to the opinion of some researchers, and I'm quoting Milanesio here, that in the case of Peron, the lack of offspring may have strengthened his symbolic paternal qualities since the people were his only children. Martinez sees his childlessness from a metaphoric perspective, revealing to the reader that Peron's infertility is possibly a result of a sexually transmitted infection. Martinez at the same time infers that his childlessness translates into the sterility of his government. As noted by Jose Munoz regarding queers, but in my opinion may be used more generally and metaphorically, quote unquote. Queers, people without children, are within the dominant culture, people without a future. They are cast as people who are developmentally stalled, forsaken, who do not have the complete life promised by heterosexual temporality. It would be fair, therefore, to suppose that infertility contributes to a queer rendering of Peron. Consequently, Peron's efforts to improve the condition of his political children is undermined. As demonstrated by this brief analysis, gender representations of Peron's populist regime are reflective of Martinez's stance on authoritarian power and the impacts of exile on the individual. They are used as a narrative device that undermines the validity of populism by feminizing the traditional patriarchal discourse and at the same time enabling its queer readings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariya, for your presentation. I hope you're all hearing me clearly now. I will give the floor now to Theo, Aiolfi, and Giulia from the University of Warwick.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just gonna share my presentation. Okay, I think it's on. Well, thank you very much. Sorry. Technological problems. Thank you very much. On behalf of Giulia and myself, I first would like to thank all of the organizers of the conference for including us in what has been so far a very engaging conference. So I really hope we maintain this track record. So just as a disclaimer a bit of sorts, this paper is still a work in progress, which means that we are very much looking forward to your comments, but we are very excited to share and present our work so far today. This paper on Bolsonaro that we call Enfrentar virus como homem, or take the virus like a man, is born from, on Bolsonaro, populism and masculinity, was born out of a conversation that Giulia and I had when we realized that in spite of coming from very different academic perspective and disciplines, our perspective overlapped in many interesting ways. So we decided to explore this topic together and see how we can develop all these ideas in a collaborative fashion. So since I admit that I still have a lot to learn about Latin American politics in general and about Brazil in particular, my own expertise instead comes from my engagement with the literature on populism and my use of a theoretical framework at the intersection of politics and performance. So what I will do first is set up a bit of a theoretical backbone of our work, and Giulia will develop a bit more the empirics that we are going to be tackling. So there have been quite a few other perspectives on populism mentioned yesterday. I've heard people talk about populism as a thin ideology. I've seen some people also mention Laclau. And so I thought it was important for our paper to establish ourselves on what we mean when we talk about populism, just so we don't conflate it with other things. So the approach that Giulia and I engage with in this paper is called the discursive performative approach to populism. And it is inspired by Laclau, but modernizing and kind of pushing it beyond its limitations as a very abstract and theoretical perspective, which this name is born out of a collective endeavor to bring together the Laclauian school, so people like Stavrakakis, Katsombekis, Panizza, and the social, cultural, and performative approaches to populism, which is more of my side of a discipline, which is why we call it a post-Laclauian approach to populism. Ooh, sorry. So what this means concretely for our article is fourfold, and I think I'm going to, I frame these as necessities to go beyond four things. The first thing is a need to go beyond normativity, and so unlike many scholars like Müller or Kasmude or even Pippa Norris, that for whom populism is defined normatively as intrinsically bad, a danger to democracy, or ambivalent towards it, and more inspired, on the other hand, by work on anti-populism, we embrace more. We decide to see populism in a normatively neutral way. I completely understand, and I don't blame any scholars in the literature for thinking this. I think it's just a different perspective. But I would say that it is due to the connotations that populism has in political discourse as a signifier, which is often used as a synonym for demagoguery, amateurism, or just extreme right or far right. So I don't see populism as inherently anti-pluralist or as an early stage of authoritarianism. But instead, what we want to say in this article, and I think it's important in the context of Bolsonaro, is that this doesn't mean we don't see the kind of threat to liberal politics that Bolsonaro poses. It's just that we don't locate it in his populism. We see populism as a tool that can be weaponized, and that serves some sort of form, some sort of ideological content. The second part, and I think it relates to that, is what I call the nationalist pitfall. That means that for many scholars in the literature, populism is basically nativism, which is an ethnic-centered and exclusive form of nationalism, which is also understandable given that most of the famous prominent cases of populism are cases of political actors that do embrace a right-wing ideology, and also because of the fact that populism takes most of its expression from democratic and electoral politics, which take place within the context of the state. So of course, the nation state and the nation as a signifier will be mobilized, but we want to dissociate that because it is theoretically unsatisfying. I'm not going to go into the details here, but I really recommend you to read Declan's famous work on the topic. So I think it is important that we do this because it allows us to really distinguish what is part of the nativist agenda and what is the populist form and how both of them are interacting. And it helps us not frame stuff that is nativist as calling it populist, and instead to focus on really what populism is and what populism does. The third thing that I think is important for our perspective to go beyond is to go beyond ideology. And many scholars in the literature, and probably the most mainstream approach to the topic is that of Mude, who says that populism is a thin ideology, saying that it is shallow in terms of what kind of content, of what kind of answers to societal and political problems it offers. But I argue that populism is not only ideologically shallow, it is ideologically empty. It's not an ideology, and that's a point that Frieden, the very person who coined these ideas of a thick and full or thin ideology, he argued that populism is simply ideologically too scrawny, even to be thin. So rather than locating populism as content or as a set of beliefs, or we consider it a form, which means that it's important to go beyond what is said and also consider how things are being said and how form and substance interact and give shape to what's going on. And so we see populism as a style that gives shape to any ideology. And the fourth thing, and I think that's the most important for me, is embracing the so-called performative turn in populism studies, which means we use concepts like performance and performativity. And just to be very short, a performance is any action done with the intention of being seen by someone else, which implies relationality, two actors interacting with each other, and reflexivity, that these people know each other. And also we use the very famous concept of performativity, mostly inspired by a Butlerian perspective on the topic. And in the case of populism, this finds its expression in what Moffat very succinctly called the way the populist leader does not speak to or for some pre-existing people, but arguably brings the people into being through his performance or her performance. So in this perspective, there's three main, the populism style is a repertoire of three main performative clusters, but for the purpose of this article, we'll only focus on identity and not transgression and crisis, although I'd be very happy to elaborate on this if somebody asks. So what I mean by identity here is that identity is seen as a social construction of what makes a group or individual distinctive from other. And arguably, identity is the core of most forms of politics or electoral politics. But what is specific about the way populism as a style performs identity is that it's two elements. The first is the performative antagonistic articulation of the people versus the elite, and the performance of self from the leader. So on the side of the people versus the elite, I'm not going to move on too long because I really want to, I think I'm already running out of time, but it's very much based on Laclau's antagonistic frontier. So there's an articulation of the people and a converse articulation of the elite. And both people and elite are empty signifiers who are filled with ideological content. And if in socialist or left-wing forms of populism, the elite is the economic oligarchy, and the people is defined in an inclusive way in populist forms of nativism, which is what we tackle here with Bolsonaro, the people is defined exclusively. And so in addition to the elite, which is often cultural, political, academic, there's an other, the migrants, indigenous, religious minorities, which is linked to the elite. And the question that we want to tackle here is who is included and who is excluded in these people. And so the performance of the leader, in this case, is a hybrid tension between appearing ordinary enough that he or she is a member of the people and being extraordinary enough that they embody the unity of the whole of the people. So it is a bit of a tightrope walk. And and we are basing ourselves on a discussion from Kantorovich, who distinguishes the two bodies of politics, the body natural, the physical body, and the body politic, the transcendent body of the people, to show that populist leaders, if they want to re-embody the people, they need to perform strength and health in their own body, which leads us to the question of notion of gender, something that has been explored notably by Geva, and also need to incorporate other notions of intersectionality when approaching the multiple layers of identity that are performed. So who is constructed in the performance of a populist leader? And I think I'll leave it to Giulia.
Hi, thank you, Theo. And can everybody hear me? Am I being audible?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, cool. So yes, I'll be real quick because we only have a couple of minutes left. We were hoping to play 2 clips. I'm not sure if that will be possible, but let's start with this first one, if you don't mind, Theo.
Sure.
O vírus está aí. Vamos ter que enfrentá-lo. Vai enfrentar como homem, pô. Não como moleque. Vamos enfrentar o vírus com a realidade. É a vida. Todos nós iremos morrer dia.
So this is the video we're taking the beginning of our title from, that some of you might have already seen or know about. And what we're interested in the little empirical data we have here for the purpose of this conference is just to look at how gender is constructed and used, and infantilization in particular is used as well. So we don't have much time to develop that. And I know that the next talk from Anna Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, will probably assuage your thirst for empirical data, since she seems to be going into more details in what promises to be a fantastic talk. But what we wanted to consider is how, as Theo said, there's a weaponization of specific type of populist discourse. And we wanted also just to say that we do agree with arguments that, for example, were also advanced by Matthias Spector in a talk that was given at the King's College event, King's College London about a month ago in the Brazil 36 years after the end of military regime celebration and concern event, where he explained that in this point of view, Bolsonaro is only a symptom rather than the cause of democratic decay in Brazil. And what we see as the performances he deploys are sort of exemplified within the COVID crisis even further, but they are part of his general rhetoric and discourse across the board. And we do identify a lot of it coming from his pro-military discourse, which stems from, firstly, his personal experience, next slide please, as an army captain when he was younger, and his continued sort of pro-military stance that makes him a candidate of order, of law and order in many ways. And what is crucial as well is that the type of binary heteronormativity on which this discourse is based also engages with a rejection and a further use of derogatory terms against different groups, including the LGBTQ+ community. So we have another example here we won't play because we're running out of time, but that uses this idea that fearfulness and focus on the COVID-19 pandemic is a mistake, right? And so throughout this, there's Bolsonaro weaves the gender, the pro-military, and a certain dictatorship nostalgia within his discourse in a way to displace the importance of the pandemic itself by seeing it as a fact of life. We will all die one day anyway, so it's not a real threat. And what we're interested in bringing this paper further when we one day hopefully will have the time, would be to consider how a lot of, next slide please, a lot of voices are raising against Bolsonaro with the adaptation, for example, here of the BML movement through Brazilian Lives Matter, and the possible future sort of counter narratives we could find, which will be focused centrally on the marginalized group, especially indigenous group that have been the most touched by the pandemic itself. So I'll finish now because I think we've run out of time.
Okay, thank you, Theo and Giulia. I'd just like to remind the audience that you can write your questions at the Q&A form, and we will read the questions to the panelists afterwards. And thank you for your presentation. I would like to give the floor now to Ana Carolina Nunes de Macedo Salles from Federal University of Ceará.
Okay, I'm trying to share here my presentation. And I also have to start the video. Okay. Are you able to see the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Ana Carolina. I'm going to present my research called Women in Bolsonaro's Administration, the Gender Roles and the Role of Gender in Sustaining Far-Right Populism during the COVID-19 pandemic. So first of all, I want to say that this is an ongoing research, so it's not concluded yet, especially because the pandemic is still going on in Brazil and pretty strongly. So I think that we'll have more data along the way. And what I'm going to show you guys here is some of the preliminary results of this research, okay? First of all, I want to contextualize the meaning of Bolsonaro's far-right populism, because as some authors point out, populism can often be used as an empty shell, describing both Hugo Chavez and Bolsonaro So I believe that when we localize it, when we place it as a far-right populism, we can take some characteristics, and it's better to define it, seeing the historical aspects of it, and what interests that Bolsonaro defends, and what goals their supporters have. So some of the characteristics of Bolsonaro's far-right populism are militarization. We see that nowadays almost 50% of the ministers of state, which are nominated by Bolsonaro, are from the military. The weakening of environmental laws, and setbacks on rights and policies related to women, LGBTQ, Black and Indigenous people, workers and unions. And he also has the ability to mobilize his electorate. That's why I believe that the term populism still can be used to describe Bolsonaro, because he always has the next election in mind. So I try to use mainly Brazilian authors to make this analysis because of the context itself. So Safatli says that neoliberal reforms in Brazil are historically unpopular. So even being a country in Latin America with dependent capitalism, we can see that we still have a lot of public important institutions here in Brazil, such as the healthcare system, public universities, and they're completely free, and it's a little peculiar compared, for example, with other countries here in South America. So what Bolsonaro tries to do is mobilizing his electorate to put this agenda through. I mean, to pass this agenda. For the context, we see that nearly 14% of the deputies that form Brazil's lower chamber are women. So out of the total of 77 women deputies, 54 are pro-government, and we call these women Bolsonaristas. Also, only 2 out of the 22 ministers of state nominated by the president himself are women, and one of these 2 are also a federal deputy. So these 2 branches, these 2 categories of politicians, they work, they more closely work with the presidency because of the constitutional law itself. The lower chamber, the Chamber of Deputies, is in charge of representing people in Brazil, while the Senate is in charge of representing the states, the federal states. So, and the ministers are nominated by Bolsonaro, so they are deeply connected with Bolsonaro himself. So in total, we are going to analyze social media from these 55 women, okay? To determine which women are Bolsonaristas, I tried to use different methods, but they didn't work out because it was hard to objectify, to make it more precise. I mean, and so first I thought that looking at their political parties would be a good way, but in Brazil we have a lot of political parties, and the deputies usually change once they are elected. They change their political party, so it was quite difficult to choose this as an element. So we tried to see by this platform called Congresso em Foco, which are the real Bolsonaristas that are the pro-government deputies because of their votes. So So we considered the ones with percentages over 50% to be aligned with the government. And even if they perform in opposition, they are actually aligned with Bolsonaro. So even if they say in social media that they hate Bolsonaro and they that abandoned Bolsonaro, in fact, they always vote according to Bolsonaro's policies and projects. So I try to use an intersectional approach to make some data about these women. And I try to analyze race and gender intersectionalities. And I also would like to analyze the class aspect, but it's a lot more complex than it seems. So I'll have to make a more deep investigation on that. And I'm focusing on, here I'm using the intersectional approach from Lelia Gonzalez, understanding that considering the historical facts that Black women were enslaved, and they are like the less represented people in our political system, so historically. And we can see that through this graph as well. Here we see that from these 55 women, 87% are white, and the other ones can be considered Black in Brazil. I mean, because Black and Pardo are two identities that makes the Black people as we know in for example, United States. So 87% of these women are white, which shows that, as Helena Hirata said, which is a sociologist here in Brazil, that these white women, when they leave the domestic space and they go to the public sphere, they don't have actually a concession of power from white men. They have to explore, they have to exploit Black women in order to leave the domestic sphere. So I think this graph shows it quite well. So this is a graph about their age, and I also had a graph about their profession. Right here, we can see that most of them have higher education, and we can also see some sectors that are very well known to be pro-government, right? Like Bolsonarista sectors, like evangelical churches are represented in this graph. We can see a lot of business women. We can see lawyers. So I believe, but this graph was made, I think it's important to point it out. This graph was made with the information that they give while they were candidates. So these are the information that they have to reveal to the electoral justice in Brazil. And in fact, I saw some controversy on it already. I saw some controversy because I saw that a lot of them are actually professional politicians. They always worked in the government. And sometimes when you see their family history, they are politicians because of their fathers and because of their husbands. So I think it's important to make a deep investigation, to do a big investigation in this. So going to these women and knowing who they are, we need to classify these Bolsonaristas. And I only have 2 minutes, oh my God. I identified 3 types of Bolsonaristas: protagonistic Bolsonaristas, invisible Bolsonaristas, and performative opposition Bolsonaristas. Right here, we have the protagonistic ones. They also engage a lot more in hate speech, and they focus mainly on Bolsonaro's masculinity and his ability to be a patriarch. So that's the main characteristic of this group of Bolsonaristas. So here we have the thesis, for example, is a great. She is a great example of this. She says that men are weak these days in these posts, and she says that Bolsonaro is able to take care, like more as a father figure of their people, better than the government who are opting for lockdown, for example, because she's against lockdown and all of that. So she always focuses on abortion, and she's pro-life and all of that. So she focused a lot on hate speech, on LGBTQ groups and women. The invisible Bolsonaristas, they don't have that much followers. I mean, protagonistic Bolsonaristas, they have more than 50,000 followers in social media in general. And invisible Bolsonaristas don't have that much. They don't use and they don't engage on social media a lot like the other group. And sometimes they focus more on the femininity part. And they try to put this image that to use it as individual solutions, making women focus on their ability to take care of the family. And the other ones are the performative opposition Bolsonaristas. We see people from different political parties here, and a lot of them, I think that this group will increase a lot during the research, because a lot of them are actually people who supported Bolsonaro at the time of the election, but right now they are saying that they are in opposition because Bolsonaro is not that popular in Brazil anymore. So I'm sorry, I think I passed the time. So you have to conclude.
Oh, you can conclude. I believe it's your last slide.
Okay. I'm so sorry. These women show that what unify Bolsonaristas are mainly gender and sexuality issues. Women from these three categories focus on the importance of the family and their roles in the family as caregivers, including topics such as health and education of their sons and daughters. And these are the main topics that they talk about. On the other hand, if we see SUS and Sistema Único de Saúde, which are the names of Brazil healthcare system, these names were not frequently mentioned in their social media. So they focus a lot on these roles of women, traditional roles, and they perform this femininity, putting a lot of pictures of their family, for example, and saying that they are cooking, saying that they take care of their sons and all of that. And we also have some more general results here, saying that, in fact, not all Bolsonaristas are the same. And we have not many Bolsonaristas, the majority of them, they don't have actually a large social media presence, although we would commonly see that in the media. So that's it. I will end my presentation. I'm so sorry to take your time.
Thank you, Ana Carolina. I will now give the floor to Stacey Hunt from Auburn University. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you. Can you guys all see my slides?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Good morning. Today I'll be talking about selection bias and intellectual imperialism in the study of populism. A recent surge in populism in Western Europe and the United States provoked a deep fascination with the topic and engendered a flurry of studies seeking to explain when, why, and how populism arises. Despite this newfound attention, there remains little agreement regarding the most fundamental characteristics of populism, with scholars struggling to advance even a basic definition of the phenomenon. This is puzzling given the decades of research on the subject in Latin America, where populism has long been recognized as the most common form of rule. Dismissing Latin American populisms as an indistinguishable wave of left populisms amid a singular obsessive focus on Hugo Chavez has resulted in a widespread failure to capitalize on the long history of Latin American populisms. Nowhere is this phenomenon more acute than in the case of Colombian President Álvaro Uribe, where dozens of Spanish language studies analyzed Uribe's populist rule, for example. Nevertheless, English language studies from the West have rejected the premise that Uribe was a populist without presenting any substantiating evidence at all, or based on a long discredited definition of populism as a profligate redistribution to the poor. The only Western reference I can find that assents to the Spanish language consensus that Uribe was a populist is Kurt Whalen's 2013 article ominously titled "Latin America's Authoritarian Drift, the Threat from the Populist Left," in which Whalen redefines democracy as neoliberal economic policies and makes democracy compatible with overt state violence. According to Whalen's new definition of democracy, Uribe and other right-wing populists in Latin America were good for democracy because they acted on behalf of neoliberal economic policies and the need to defeat violent leftist guerrillas. Whalen claims that countries that have experienced right-wing populism, such as Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, are today stable democracies, marked by steady institutions, pluralist party systems, and respectable democratic governance. By contrast, left-wing populism has a more negative balance, Whalen claims. Left-wing populisms, I quote, put democracy to death, through their incorporation of the poor and previous marginalized. Right-wing populists such as Alberto Fujimori and Álvaro Uribe, who deployed paramilitary death squads and secret police forces to put people to death, had no such effect. As unfounded as this conclusion is, it is hardly unique. In 2013, Levitsky and Loxton agreed with the fundamental premise that violence is compatible with democracies in countries allied with the United States, noting that Uribe was responsible for only episodic human rights violations, abuses which, in their opinion, didn't skew the playing field against the political opposition. This phenomenon is what I call intellectual imperialism, overlooking or appropriating the vast body of knowledge on populist executives in Latin America while selectively choosing cases and interpreting data in order to arrive at preconceived conclusions that parrot US foreign policy priorities. Intellectual imperialism has enabled systematic selection bias, distorted data collection and analysis, and legitimized theoretical findings, thereby impeding the study of populist rule. In this article, I seek to address this pervasive case selection bias by conducting a comparative case study of prototypical populists Alberto Fujimori and former Colombian President Álvaro Uribe, based on Kenneth Roberts' 5-point definition of populist executives. Roberts argued that populism consists of a paternalistic and personalistic, though not necessarily charismatic leader who is extremely popular and capable of sustaining a broad, heterogeneous, multi-class political coalition concentrated in subaltern sectors of society. Populist leaders deploy a top-down process of political mobilization that bypasses institutionalized forms of mediation, concentrating powers in the executive, and they espouse amorphous and eclectic ideologies loosely framed around anti-establishment, anti-elite rhetoric. Finally, populists buttress their support through widespread corruption and clientelism, bypassing regional governments and existing institutions to distribute goods directly from the executive office to ensure political obedience and support. Writing as a corrective to the pervasive use of populism to denote profligate, unwise social spending, Roberts emphasized that populism is a question of dominance, not distribution, a specific way of competing for and exercising political power untethered to any particular market model. Uribe assumed office just 2 years after Fujimori resigned, and a number of Spanish language publications have explored their uncanny similarities. Both leaders were deeply personalistic and paternalistic leaders who put forth explicitly racialized notions of being hardworking outsiders and deeply gendered notions of being divinely ordained national saviors. Eschewing traditional parties, both Fujimori and Uribe established their own political movements and traveled incessantly to meet directly with constituents in democratic workshops, as they call them, held around the country, where they personally attended to citizens' requests. Both dominated media, particularly radio and television, to have constant, uninterrupted, and direct communication with their constituents. Both executives were extraordinarily popular, winning repetitive elections by wide margins in their first round, consistently reporting 70 to 80% approval ratings, brilliantly co-opting political opponents, skillfully crafting broad political coalitions, and obtaining legislative supermajorities. Third, both Fujimori and Uribe deployed a top-down process of political mobilization that bypassed institutionalized forms of mediation and concentrated power in the executive. Both presidents took advantage of the failure of existing institutions to resolve their respective national crises and created personal political movements, rallied against the partyocracy on one hand and politicking on the other, created shadow and parallel ministerial and judicial institutions, and bypassed or co-opted the judiciary, legislature, and regional governments, forming policy and distributing benefits directly out of their presidential ministries in an astonishing concentration of power in the executive. Fourth, both Fujimori and Uribe largely abdicated responsibility for economic policy to neoliberal ideologues and international financial institutions, and consistently relied on mano dura policies that reduced political opposition to terrorism, refused to negotiate or compromise with political opponents or terrorists, and sought the military defeat and total elimination of their enemies. Both continued to rely on such policies and discourse even after all relevant armed actors were defeated or demobilized, continually presenting terrorism as an urgent threat that only they could solve. Finally, Uribe and Fujimori did buttress their support through widespread corruption and clientelism, bypassing regional governments and existing institutions to distribute goods directly from their executive office to ensure political obedience, but also a vast militarization of their countries and embrace of paramilitary despots, the politicization of intelligence agencies that were turned into secret police forces, and the use of intimidation, phone tapping, torture, and assassination engendered widespread and pervasive violence and fear. This comparison exposes several heretofore overlooked variables and causal mechanisms in the study of populist leadership that lend to our understanding of contemporary populism, both in the Americas and beyond. First, the documents reviewed here suggest that gender was a constitutive part of populist power in these two cases. Despite Roberts identifying paternalism as a key component of populist leadership nearly 30 years ago, mainstream scholars have grossly failed to operationalize, theorize, or study this aspect of populist leadership, instead turning a blind eye to dozens of studies that detail the intricate and constitutive roles of gender in populism. Preliminary data of my own, presented in a related paper, suggest a parallel process of intellectual imperialism in which scholars of populism delight in the frequency of criminal sexual transgressions by male populists, falsely equate the likes of Sarah Palin and Silvio Berlusconi, and continue to insist that populism is ungendered, equally available as a political strategy to men and women, an assertion that defies available data while ignoring the extensive contributions of gender scholars, particularly surrounding the nexus of militarization and masculinity. Second, populism is not ruled by plebiscite, as argued by Whalen. Populist power is personalistic, residing in one person and not fungible to downlist candidates, chosen successors, or even the populist policy initiatives. Fujimori and Uribe were frequently unable to garner sufficient support to enact constitutional reforms or policy package through popular votes, making them notably unsuccessful in rule by plebiscite. In fact, they routinely sought to suppress referendums or plebiscites on initiatives they opposed. Moreover, the evidence presented here suggests that scholars should be wary of any preordained determinations on populism among populist hands chosen successors. Neither Keiko Fujimori nor Juan Manuel Santos or later Iván Duque in Colombia approximated either the popularity or the populist power of their predecessors. Third, despite widespread agreement that populism is a political, not economic phenomenon, scholars continue to operationalize populism in economic terms. Roberts himself identified the poor as the key constituency of Fujimori's multi-class political coalition, concentrated in subaltern sections of a society in which subaltern was explicitly operationalized as economically marginalized working poor and informal sectors. He also highlighted the role of economic crisis and eclectic economic policy responses to the exclusion of other policy arenas, and emphasized the redirection of economic funds toward the poor as the source of Fujimori's power. Oh, sorry. This corresponds with widespread suspicion that populists whip up support from largely unorganized masses to an office, despite extensive and detailed descriptions of the way in which populist successors relied on the co-opting of existing grassroots organizations, such as soup kitchens, suffrage groups, and local health initiatives. This comparison suggests that more must be done to understand populism as a political phenomenon, moving beyond economic policies, events, and actors as the only reliable variables, and correct the routine pathologization of the poor in political science. In both cases at hand, elite actors were far more important than subalterns in the construction and exercise of populist power, receiving far more illicit money in the form of bribes and patronage, and having far more power to influence politics. Their coalitions were more precisely multi-sectoral than multi-class, drawing key support from religious, cultural, political, economic, and military elites in what is more aptly described as heterogeneous social constituencies. Finally, the heretofore narrow focus on the role of economic crisis has distorted the central role of the armed conflicts and pervasive violence in framing the nation as under attack and providing enduring feelings of trauma and victimization that populist leaders could draw on to justify their constant emphasis on law and order. Both leaders were referred to as Teflon presidents because they seemed to miraculously weather recurrent scandals revealing the violence and corruption of their regimes. But it must be noted that Fujimori and Uribe ruled because of violence, not in spite of it. Both relied on the outright intimidation and persecution of the opposition that created a culture of fear, silenced opposition, preempted public criticism, and prevented the formulation of a coherent alternative, and impeded the formation of a critical mass to challenge populist rule.
Sorry, Stacey, are you finished? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
Quite the conclusion, right?
Thank you very much. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. I would like to follow to the Q&A. I have one question from the audience and the other ones were in the chat. So I will say them all and then I will give the floor to the panelists. There's a question for those who study Brazil from Paulo Ricci. Bolsonaro is sometimes presented as not only populist, but nationalist. What kind of nationalism is at stake if others are not a central theme in Brazil? And we have more specific questions. We have a question for Mariya. I like your anecdote about Peron and Mussolini. Do you have other examples of Peron's expressions of affinity with Mussolini? We have also two questions for Theo and Giulia. The first one of whether Bolsonaro is really nativist. Wouldn't nationalism be more accurate term for Bolsonaro? And if they looked into possible connections, correlations between the performativity of populism and performativity of gender. And for Ana Carolina, what are some of the main reasons for the performative opposition to desert Bolsonaro? And we have two questions for Stacey. Would it be safe to call Fujimori a nativist, or is he someone who hijacked indigenous identity? And another question is about the legacy of Uribe and Fujimori. Are they still popular? Do they still have support? I think I'll give the floor to Mariya and then we'll follow the order of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, there is still a lot of debate whether or not Peron's regime was modeled after the European fascist regimes. There are a lot of studies, one in particular by Umberto Cucchetti, that makes us believe that apparently Peron borrowed quite heavily from the fascist regime's ideologies. And that is also because everything that I've studied, of course, is viewed through Martinez's creative artistic lens. And apparently Martinez agrees that Peron represents, and Peron's government represents an Argentinian version of European fascist regimes. There has never been definite proof. There is no historical documents that would back Peron's claim that he indeed met Mussolini and talked to him. Of course, there are documents that testify that he was present for some of Mussolini's speeches at some events, but there is no proof that he actually met him in person. Whilst in his biography, Peron claims that he did. He quotes Mussolini extensively. And there is something that I also found fascinating is the in terms of gender is the metaphoric representation of the popular masses as feminine entity, I should say, and the populist leader as the masculine entity. There is another one where I found the quote, I'll just quote it directly, where Peron talks about witnessing one of Mussolini's speeches. As evening fell, the Duce appeared on a balcony of the palace. He looked to the left, he looked to the right, his imperious jaw mesmerizing the uncertain crowd. He infused it with a sense of security, setting it aglow. He began a dialogue with it, little by little, quelled the fear and shock his words produced. So clearly we can see that the masses are represented as a feminine entity possessed by the masculine leader. And this type of discourse is very common in Mussolini, in Peron, and more recently in also in Fidel Castro, and there is quite a bit of research done on that topic. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mariya. I'm sorry, because of the time, we don't have that much time to answer all the questions. So I'll give the floor to Theo and Giulia, and then Ana Carolina, and then Stacey.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. These are super interesting, and I'll try to be short this time. And again, I wanted to apologize to my co-author for taking over. I get a bit intense when I talk about theory, and I think I lost track of time. But I think I'll start with a question that Mariya asked us. So, is it possible? Have you looked into the connections and correlations between the performativity of populism and the performativity of gender, considering Butler? Oh, absolutely. I really like the time to engage with it because I think. Anyway, this was poor time management on my side, but the main inspiration from here is a great work of Dorit Geva, who talks about populism as a gendered performative style structured by hegemonic masculinity and femininity. And the particular angle that, and we didn't have the time to really develop that clearly, but there is a connection between the performativity of gender and power. And the bigger argument that we were trying to make is that democratic politics have disembodied the metaphorical people, the body politic. And so populist leaders must performatively embody and articulate the people. In order to do so, they reconnect the body politic in their in their literal body. What that, to use the expression of Kantorovich. So what that means practically is a necessity to perform strength, health, hypermasculinity for men, for women, for female populist leaders. It implies pariah or frontier femininity, but I don't want to go too much about it. But if you're more interested in this, I really recommend Mariya Esperanza Casulo's very recent chapter, and a wonderful chapter in the edited volume called Populism in Global Perspective, where she talks about populism as a synecdochal representation. And she talks about the way Kirchner, and I think she mentioned someone, she just mentioned Evita Peron as well, but I forgot, she mentioned two or three more case studies, and she describes this intersection of gender and populism in terms of performativity. Giulia, did you want to add anything on this?
Not as much, though I think in the examples we were looking at, it's interesting because Mariya, you talk about how the crowd is feminized and the leader is hyper-masculine. And in our case, I think what's interesting is that there's a tendency of infantilizing the public. So it's more like sort of a dynamic that is a parent towards a child. And that is found again in Bolsonaro's sort of discourse about the previous generations that were stronger, that were better. So I think we were looking at kind of there, but we didn't at the time to sort of do enough research as well.
And I know we only have 2 minutes. I'm gonna combine together the question of Anthony Pereira and the question of Paolo Ricci, which is very interesting as well on nativism. And I think what this really shows here is, and I will definitely take the blame instead of Giulia here, is my Western bias in empirics. That is really salient when I use the word nativism. So it is true that maybe we talked about it, but I decided to keep the word, but I think I might have to drop the concept. But nativism is based on the Casmuder's distinction between civic and ethnic nationalism, civic forms of nationalism being defining the people in an open way along lines of right and law, whereas ethnic forms are define the people along racial, cultural, religious lines. But it is true that such a distinction was developed for a European context and loses relevance in post-colonial societies like Brazil. So it might be problematic when you think of settler colonialism and so on. And I still think that there's a specific way Bolsonaro talks about the nation and what it's like to be Brazilian, which excludes indigenous communities, favors Western model of whiteness, and as you said, include many Brazilians as enemies. But I do think the distinction still has relevance. Maybe it is ironic, and we were talking about it with Giulia, but the use of nativism works when he literally excludes the natives, so the indigenous communities, from his perspective of the nation. But maybe we should just talk about exclusionary and inclusionary nationalism. I don't know, I'm open to this. But for the question of political enemies like socialists and communists, it is a specificity of nationalism as a whole to close their understanding of the nation to those who don't share the conservative or reactionary agenda. So it's normal that we exclude the leftists. And as for people he admires, I think it's interesting, but it rather hints at other elements like his admiration for strongman politics and hyper-masculine forms of governance, which stem from, I would say, conservative and religious and nationalist ideology. And lastly, that connects with Paulo's questions. Yes, immigrants are not the ones othered in Bolsonaro's conception of the nation, like Mexicans from Trump or North African immigrants for European nationalists, but that does mean that his performance of a nation is, that doesn't mean that his performance of a nation is not closed. I think he is still a nationalist, that he imposes strict borders on who is and who is not Brazilian, but we definitely need to consider this a bit more in terms of actual terminology.
Thank you, Theo. I'm sorry.
One little thing really quickly.
I'm sorry, we have only 5 minutes and there are questions from for and Stacey. If you can write on the chat maybe, or at the Q&A, I think it can optimize some time. Thank you. Ana Carolina.
Okay, so I'll start with Anthony's question, Anthony Pereira. The main reason for this, let me read the question first. What are some of the main reasons for the performative opposition Bolsonaristas to desert Bolsonaro? Okay, so it is because we had a crisis in Bolsonaro's political party called PSL. and it's a conservative party, but Bolsonaro wants to be the main leader of it. So during the election, lots of politicians that were not very well known said they were allies of Bolsonaro. And then during his government, he started giving important positions in committees for ministers for the military. So we had a crisis because Bolsonaro also wanted to make his own political party, and then we had this break in PSL, which was his political party. So here in the Q&A section, we have what is the risk of such female support for Bolsonaro? And I believe is the delegitimization. It's because you delegitimate. I think it's how you pronounce it. I'm so sorry if I say it wrongly. But the feminist movements, and you can dismantle women's rights in different ways, even if they're not on law. I mean, even if they are just another type of norm, we can dismantle from the inside, and that's what Bolsonaro is doing. And they also they get concepts like empowering women and all of that, and say that they are the real empowered ones. So they make their own narratives on what's feminist and what's not. And I believe that's the big problem in it. Isn't the Brazilian media? That's it?
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all the Q&A, so I had to filter some questions. So I'll give the room to Stacey so that she can answer. Then we'll finish our presentation.
Much to say about race in the case of Fujimori's Peru, but no, I don't think he was nativist at all. And but what I do think is that, you know, the Japanese community in Peru at the time, you know, his parents were indentured servants if he was born in, but in any case, they were indeed like indentured laborers. And Japanese people in Peru were incredibly marginalized in the way that he bizarrely took the name El Chino, despite that, but honored. He was very, if he was nativist or nationalistic, it was toward Japan, but was able to fuse that. Yes, I think his appropriation of indigenous attire and things was completely utilitarian, but it was both brilliant and very logical. It was actually very easy. These are two marginalized and discriminated groups, and he was an agricultural expert, right? He was considered for to be Minister of Agriculture and had spent extensive time in rural communities. So this was a very kind of natural, even though, you know, this is the same man that eventually, you know, adopted genocidal, right, reproductive policies toward that same group. So you know, I think it's super complex, but really interesting, particularly in that fusion of both Japanese and indigenous. So, and then just about the legacy, briefly, the legacy of these two leaders, you know, they are still popular, but I think you see, you know, you see this divergence because Fujimori was, you know, taken from power, and now his proxy, his daughter, has never been elected into office. So he maintains this level of popularity that that you don't see necessarily with Uribe, because especially with he got to handpick his two successors. And first he had a huge fight with his first successor, Santos, because of the pre-securements that he oversaw with the guerrilla. And then his second successor, Duque, that is the current president, he's been so largely panned as a pig in Latin, I mean, like a little pig. So he's seen as inept and fat and, well, just inept in all these ways, and childish. And you see this inability to transfer power. And in fact, because Duque is there and you see how crappy he is, that, you know, the Uribe's power and popularity himself have fallen, even though people they approve of his democratic and his security measures. You see his popularity waning. They have in fact hit the lowest time. And also you see the evolution of populism over, like, even strong populist leaders over decades. They either become more repressive or their popularity declines, right? So you see this from, you know, what's going on in Russia today to in this case of Colombia, and he's not in power. He can't recur to oppression anymore to bolster his support. So you see it waning. So they are still popular, particularly in the case of Peru. You see Fujimori has widespread, and it's possible that Kiko wins the next elections on his shirt coats. It's possible. You never know. And people still, because of security, they say, you know, his legacy is peace, and we support him and we approve of his security policies. So I'll leave that at that.
Thank you. I would like to thank everyone, for watching the panel. I would like to thank all the panelists. All the presentations were great, and I hope you stick around for the next panel, which will be about institutions. Thank you very much.